There's a mistake we make surprisingly often inside organizations. We confuse activity with progress. When everybody is busy, it feels as though the system must be productive. Calendars are full, projects are underway, messages are flying back and forth, and people rarely have enough time to get everything done. But busyness only tells us that people are doing things. It doesn't tell us whether the work itself is moving. That distinction is at the heart of FlowSight. And in this first FlowSight in the Wild scenario, I want to show you what happens when a team that appears highly productive is actually being slowed down by something almost nobody can see. Imagine an organization where nearly everyone is operating at full capacity. Calendars are packed, project boards are overflowing, and there's almost no idle time anywhere. From the outside, this looks like a highly utilized team, which sounds like exactly what we should want. But underneath all that activity, something else is happening. Delivery is slowing down, deadlines are slipping, customers are becoming frustrated, and managers are constantly rearranging priorities because something always seems to be falling behind. That creates a strange paradox. The people seem to be working at maximum capacity, while the organization itself is becoming less capable of delivering. And when leadership sees that combination, the natural question is almost always the same. Do we need more people? It's easy to see why leadership reaches that conclusion. Demand has increased, delivery has slowed, and the existing team already looks stretched. So adding capacity feels logical. Maybe we hire another person, bring in contractors, or turn to AI to automate some of the work. Any of those approaches might be useful, but there's a danger in applying them before we understand the system. If the real problem is a bottleneck somewhere inside the workflow, adding more people simply puts more work into that same system. And if we automate everything upstream of the bottleneck, we may actually make matters worse because now we're delivering the work to the constraint even faster. So before we ask how to increase capacity, FlowSight asks a different question. How is the work actually moving? This is where the diagnosis begins. So rather than focusing on the loudest complaint or immediately trying to make people work faster, we start looking for signals of structural friction. Where is work waiting? Where does something repeatedly get sent back? Where are people improvising because the official process isn't really working? Where do decisions begin to slow things down? And perhaps, most revealing of all, where does work seem to move perfectly well until it suddenly stops? These questions change what we're looking for. Instead of studying how busy individual people are, we begin following the work itself. And once we do that, we can start seeing the organization in a very different way. The traditional view of productivity tends to begin with utilization. Are people fully booked? Are they working hard enough? Are we getting enough output from the resources we have? When the answer appears to be no, the default response is often to increase capacity, push harder, or use technology to make individual tasks happen faster. FlowSight shifts the unit of attention from the individual to the system. Instead of asking whether everyone is busy, we ask whether the work is reaching the finish line. Instead of immediately adding capacity, we look for the friction preventing the capacity we already have from flowing through the organization. And AI takes on a different role as well. Rather than using AI only to perform individual tasks faster, we can use it to help us see patterns across the system more clearly. That change in perspective is what reveals the real problem in this scenario. So when we followed the work, we discovered that the individual contributors weren't particularly slow. They were actually completing their work at a responsible pace. The completed work was waiting. Several streams of work were converging on a single approval point, and over time, that approval point had become responsible for more and more decisions. As the queue grew, deadlines began slipping. Managers responded by shifting priorities to get important projects unstuck, while employees started interrupting the approver for status updates because they couldn't move forward without a decision. Those interruptions made it even harder for the approver to clear the queue, which created more delays, more urgency, and even more interruptions. In other words, all the problems compounded. Nobody designed the system to behave this way, but the organization had unintentionally created a reinforcing loop in which everybody became busier while the system became slower. And once we could see that loop, the real constraint became much easier to identify. The constraint wasn't staffing, it wasn't motivation, and it wasn't individual productivity. The problem wasn't even that too much work was coming into the organization. The constraint was decision authority. Something that had originally been created as a reasonable quality safeguard had gradually evolved into a centralized checkpoint, and too many routine decisions now depended on the same person. That's important because it completely changes the solution. If we had simply added employees, we would have generated even more work that eventually arrived at the same checkpoint. If we had pushed everyone to become more productive, we would have filled the queue faster. So the issue wasn't how hard people were working. The issue was where the work needed permission to continue. Now we can make a much more intelligent change. We don't eliminate human judgment because judgment still matters enormously. Instead, we become much more deliberate about where it's actually required. Routine decisions can move forward within clearly defined boundaries without another layer or approval. Higher risk decisions still receive human review because the consequences justify the additional attention. And unusual situations can be escalated to experienced leaders because those are precisely the moments when judgment, context, and experience genuinely add value. This does something subtle but important. We aren't removing human intelligence from the system. We're concentrating it. Instead of asking experienced people to approve everything, we reserve their attention for the places where experience can actually change the outcome. And once the workflow has been redesigned around that principle, technology becomes much more useful. There's tremendous pressure in business right now to put AI into existing workflows. And sometimes that does make perfect sense. But there's a simple principle worth remembering. Technology should follow our understanding of the system. If we automate a broken workflow, we haven't necessarily improved anything. We may simply be moving work faster toward the same bottleneck. Once the system has been redesigned, however, AI can become a powerful accelerator. It can help identify patterns across the workflow, flag unusual cases that deserve escalation, summarize information before human review, and detect work that falls outside of any normal set patterns. That's a very different use of AI. Rather than replacing judgment indiscriminately, AI helps the organization decide where judgment is needed and makes it easier for experienced people to focus on those moments. The technology improves the flow because we first understood the flow. Once the decision bottleneck was cleared, something interesting happened. Managers didn't have to spend as much time chasing updates because fewer projects were mysteriously getting stuck. Employees gained more autonomy because they understood which decisions they could make on their own, while experienced people could focus their attention on the exceptions where their judgment actually mattered. And the organization became faster. Not because everybody suddenly worked harder, and not because we demanded more productivity from already busy people. It became faster because the work stopped waiting. That's one of the central ideas behind FlowSight. When an organization begins slowing down, our instinct is often to add something, more people, more effort, more software, more automation, or more AI. Sometimes that's exactly what the system needs, but sometimes the better answer begins by finding what's causing the work to stop. AI can help us see patterns across more of the system, while experience helps us understand which of those patterns actually matter. And Flowsight brings those two forms of intelligence together so we can identify the constraint and make a better decision about what to change next. So, if everyone in your organization seems busy, but the work still isn't moving the way it should, there's one question worth asking before you add anything else. Where is the work actually waiting? Thanks for your attention.